Hello everyone. So we can just switch over to this, and from here we should pretty much be ready to start. So yeah, the topic of course for this stream is going to be my Avatar and Korra book rankings. So I'm going to do my personal list first. You probably roughly know what it is if you've seen my content before, and then we'll get to working on sort of a group list that is maybe more representative of kind of the fandom at large, or at least the group here in the chat at large. So what I have here is kind of three documents. This first one here is literally just a list of episodes, because since we're going to be discussing all of the books here, we might as well discuss the parts of it, of course. So we have book 1, 2, 3 for ATLA. We've got book 1, 2, 3, and 4 for Korra. And then to briefly explain what some of the colors are. The green is obviously just to represent the book, so when I'm scrolling through I can quickly know when each one starts and finishes. And then as it says here, any episode that's highlighted in yellow is an episode that I placed within the top 10 on my own episode ranking list. And then any episode highlighted in red is an episode I placed in the bottom 5 of my rankings. And again, this is just when scrolling through each book, an easy visual way to see, at least for me, presenting it, where the kind of positives and main negatives for each book actually are. So that's what we're going to be covering here. And yeah, I guess we'll just get straight into my own personal ranking list. Again, we're not really going to be discussing this one too much. This is more to just immediately present how I feel about Avatar and Korra ahead of the discussion in the group list. So I'm not going to do too much explanation here. I'm pretty much just going to let it be. So for Avatar, my ranking has pretty much always been number 1, book 3 fire, number 2, book 2 earth, and number 3, book 1 water. So sort of a reverse chronological order. And I think that's a pretty common opinion. Some people do book 2 first, but some people rate book 1 a little higher, but you don't see it too often. So I don't think my Avatar ranking is anything particularly controversial. My Korra ranking tends to be a little bit controversial. So for me, book 2 Spirits has always been my favorite book of Korra. Book 1 Air is my number 2. And I actually have switched it up recently, because if you've listened to my content in the past, I've always tended to rate book 3 as my least favorite. But I think I switched that up. Doing the kind of research, kind of creating the episode ranking lists again, I really, I think, had an awakening to just the idea that I actually think some of the problems I have with book 4 are bigger within book 4. And they create sort of a bigger problem for book 4, especially because it is the final book, that I think I get a little bit more out of book 3 ultimately. But again, the general thing here is that for me, it is absolutely a lock that it's book 1 and 2 ahead of book 3 and 4. And that's sort of always been the way I've kind of tended to do things. I think a few years ago I tended to have like book 1 more at number 3, but that's gone up in my rankings a bit. So I think that's where I stand right now. I think book 3 and 4 have the more major problems as books of Korra. So that's kind of how I personally go with it. Pretty standard for Avatar, but I suppose a little bit controversial for Korra. But again, I think most people have kind of interesting lists with Korra. It's not really too, even though there's only 4 books, you know, there is quite a bit of kind of back and forth in that, you know, book 2 tends to be a book people rate quite low, but then a lot of people also rate book 1 quite low, which I really wouldn't quite agree with. And then I tend to feel book 3 and 4 get a little bit too much credit. in the chat, I thought we were going to rank the books together under one list. Yes, we will. Like I said, this is my personal list, and we will work together here to make this group list. This was more to just present, this is going to be where I'm presenting it from. So, just so you're not kind of weirded out by like, wait, why when we're placing Korra books are you really, really heavily promoting book 2 as one that should be high up on our list? Well, it's because it's a personal favorite of mine. That's the reason for that. And then here is my combined list. When we actually combine the books together, this is how I tend to rank it. So book 3 Fire, I think, is sort of a clear out on top for me. I have book 2 Spirits ahead of book 2 Earth, just because I think the highs that book 2 hits for me are kind of everything I want from Avatar, and it beats out the sort of raw consistency of book 2, which doesn't maybe have as many high moments. Then we get into the rest of the sort of Korra list. Book 1 Air, book 3 Change, book 4 Balance. This is just the order from here. And then I have book 1 Water as being the weakest book. Again, I don't want to get too much of the discussion out of the way here before we get into it, but that is something I tend to really heavily quite agree with, is that I think book 1 Water is pretty much the weakest book of Avatar. And we'll get into it as we go through it, but I think that's pretty fair, because the final thing before we get into trying to create the other list is just, we are discussing Avatar compared to Korra, and this tends to always be a little bit of a controversial topic. We know the fandom in general leans towards Avatar. I think most people do, but some people do prefer Korra. I have always said that I lean towards Avatar, but only slightly, in that I don't think you can accuse me of being overly negative towards Korra. I think I've always been fair to it and sort of like, treated it in the same light as Avatar. So that's why like there has to be that realization of, for some people, it'll just be their ATLA list stacked on top of their Korra list, and that's the complete list. To me, I think there has to be some level of meshing the two lists together for a combined list. Otherwise, I don't really think we're doing the series credit, and that is because I think, both shows are different in format. This is going to be the fundamental difference between Avatar and Korra. I've always said it comes down to the format of both shows. ATLA, getting into the list here, is 3 books, each with 20, within the final book has 21 episodes. There's a lot of episodes in each book, and so there's time to do the big moments, but it also has time to do the more lighter episodes. You have moments to do a painted lady, to do a headband. You've got time in Avatar for a Cave of Two Lovers or an Avatar Day. Same with something like a fortune teller. Korra doesn't have that opportunity. But what it means is that, sure, you don't often get those moments that just get to be a sort of not plot focused thing that's more sort of character focused. Instead, every episode of Korra has to be really, really important. And so in a way, sort of on average, each episode of Korra is slightly sort of more eventful, you would say, than an episode of Avatar, because in book 1, each episode has to be a 12th of the story. There's no room for anything else, and you're begging for more episodes. Book 2 has the most episodes, and even it doesn't really have time for a character like little side plot that's not ultimately going to be relevant to the main story. And the same absolutely applies with book 3 and 4. Episode, you would definitely say the main thing is that, like, wow, each episode has something important going on in it outside of remembrances, but there's still room to work with, and so we always are looking for sort of the balance. And maybe at times Avatar maybe has a few too many not plot focused episodes per season, but Korra has too few. And it's all about sort of how you really judge that. And that's going to be something I think that's very interesting to consider as we move into Avatar Studios content, because we're going to be getting new series, standalone sort of series, main series, that sort of stuff. And I'm very interested to see what they do with episode count, because of course, because it's going to be online, they're not going to have the sort of, I suppose, typically expected order of episodes, and that they could do a kind of more interesting run of episodes. Like, I'm kind of thinking a sort of like 16 episode season might be sort of the perfect middle ground between the ATLA style and the Korra style. But anyway, that's just explaining my sort of personal list. So let's get into doing the sort of discussion here. So we're going to take our time, of course. We're going to let the chat, of course, have their discussion. We just have to find the right way to do this properly. So we're going to start, like I did, by ranking Avatar first. Then we'll do the Korra books. Then we'll go about making the combined list. Let's not try and do all of this at once. So let's go into Avatar. So I think the first thing that to me feels obvious is does anyone disagree with the idea that Avatar Book 1 is the weakest book of Avatar? That's, I think, the first obvious question, in that I personally have seen very few people ever rank Book 2 or 3 below Book 1. And I don't want it to just sort of be a default thing right here at the start, taking away all the discussion. But I think this is potentially the most simple placement on the whole list, is to just immediately be like Book 1 Water, Avatar number 3. So I think that's pretty kind of clear. Like, obviously, if you disagree, by all means. Let me just finish this. So we'll jump into it here a little bit with the list of episodes. So you can see for me, of the 20 episodes, like I said, red are going to be bottom 5 episodes. For me, Book 1 has 4 of the bottom 5 for Avatar. The Spirit World, Waterbending Scroll, Great Divide, and Bottle of the Water Tribe. And then I think a lot of people would put perhaps an episode like The Fortune Teller in there as well, as potentially something like Northern Air Temple, as like there's at least 5-6 episodes that don't stand out too much in the grand scheme of Avatar, whereas the strong episodes, I think, the finale of course stands out. 18, 19, 20 do really stand out. Of course, your opening is strong, but I don't think anyone is going to particularly argue that 101 or 102 is like the absolute best episodes. 103 is strong, and then the thing with a lot of these episodes, the likes of 104, 105, 106, is that they're strong character episodes in terms of like Bumi in The King of Omashu, Suki introduced in The Warriors of Kyoshi. They're strong, but there's not really a lot of plot, and this is the problem with Book 1, is that it's like first 3 episodes plot, then you're like, okay, no plot, little bit of plot right at the end, not particularly plot heavy, but you're world building along the way. Then you get into, I consider this to be a really weird episode just because it's called The Spirit World, but we never actually see the Spirit World. It sets up a few interesting things in terms of it's a setup for an actual, like, I think really strong episode where the plot of the series sort of finally properly comes out in 108. 109 again is on the weaker side of things. I also would say Jet is kind of on the weaker side of things, even though the Aang Jet fight is actually really good and Jet is an interesting character. The Great Divide, it is heavily underrated, but it's still not, it's hard to make the case that it's higher than maybe like second last, in my opinion. Storm, fantastic. Blue Spirit is very good. The Fortune Teller tends to be an episode where it more depends on, like, are you super into Katang? If you are, you probably value this episode quite highly. If you're not particularly into it, it's probably on the lower end. but I think there's enough fun stuff going on in here that it works. Bottom of the Water Tribe, I think suffers a little bit from being right next to the Deserter, in that there are 2 episodes where like Aang does something wrong back to back, and they should have been separated a little bit. I think Bottom of the Water Tribe probably should have been much earlier in the series, in my mind. I think that probably would have worked out just a little bit better, of having Bato earlier on, just to separate them a little bit. The Deserter is very good. The Northern Air Temple I kind of go back and forth on, but I don't think it's particularly memorable. And then final 3 episodes are very strong, with 1 episode in the top 10 in my mind. But there's a few episodes that are just outside the top 10, like The Storm and so on. It is, underrated. I definitely would agree Book 1 tends to be underrated, but sort of like The Great Divide, it's one where you're making the argument to have it not be underrated by saying it should be above Book 2 Earth or Book 3 Fire, and you suddenly begin to realize that, okay, they have their own super strong episodes, and we're not really having much of a kind of discussion here. In terms of if you happen to really like the sort of island hopping sort of campaign we have going on here, then sure, Book 1 really stands out to you. But I don't think there's going to be much argument with okay, that's pretty clear. Then we get into the big one, and it's an interesting discussion. It's always between, is Book 2 the best or is Book 3 the best? And ultimately, I find this tends to just be a pretty nicely spirited debate. I don't really see a lot of people getting particularly angry or annoyed about this. It's just they're 2 amazing books of Avatar. It's a little bit of a toss-up between them. As you know from my list, I rate Book 3 above Book 2. But obviously this is the main, I suppose, topic at this point that we're getting into here, is Book 2 or Book 3 for the number 1 spot. For sure. So Book 2, let's sort of run through it here. So as you can see here on the list, it has 3 episodes in the top 10, no episodes in the bottom 5. But it is interesting that there's only 3 episodes either top or bottom here. The rest are sort of more middle to maybe kind of upper mid-range. Whereas if you look at Book 3 Fire, there's 5, 6 episodes in the top 10. There is 1 episode in the bottom 5, but you then suddenly realize that there's a lot of episodes that are kind of there and thereabouts. The likes of Boiling Rock Part 1, Firebending Masters, both parts of the Invasion as well, that are kind of super, super close to being in the top 10. And that's kind of why I always tend to give Book 3 Fire the edge over Book 2, is just that this run of episodes here, from 310 all the way to the finale, 321, is incredible. The only episode you would say that perhaps breaks it up a little bit is Ember Island Players, in that some people tend to not like it, but in general I think most people would say, for the type of episode that it is, and that they went for this, they went for a Calm Before the Storm episode, this is probably a best in class of that type of episode. So I don't think you can bring Book 3 down too much for having it, in that this, as a Calm Before the Storm, is a million times better than 309, which also attempts to do roughly the same thing, but kind of struggles quite badly. The Book 3 criticism you'll typically come across is, I think, most people not particularly rating this kind of first section here. Obviously, you kind of have to, I think, remove the premiere episodes out of things, because the premiere episodes always have they always have something going on. They're always notable in some way. So the question really is sort of this run of episodes before we hit the ride to the finish, basically, for Avatar. The Headband, The Painted Lady, Sokka's Master, The Beach, Avatar and the Fire Lord, Runaway, Puppet Master, Nightmares and Daydreams. So obviously you have your clear sort of weaker episodes. Nightmares and Daydreams, I think most people would rate The Painted Lady as being a little bit lower down. People tend to be a little hit or miss on The Beach as well. I tend to quite like it, but I also tend to quite like The Painted Lady. The The thing is, though, a lot of people highlight these episodes as being like, well, Book 3 Fire has this grouping of episodes before the plot, I suppose, kicks in. But it's the same with Book 2. Like, you have the Avatar state to open things off, but then you do have, like, the Cave of Two Lovers is an equivalent episode to the Headband. You then kind of get back to the plot a little bit with Return to Omashu. But then you do have, the Swamp and Avatar Day, which are a little bit like the Painted Lady and Asaka's Master or the Beach. And then you have to keep in mind that there's subplots happening around the place. That in a lot of the Book 2 episodes, you have your Zuko subplot going on in the background, whereas the gang get most of the spotlight here. But even in these episodes, you still have, like, the interesting dynamic of, like, Zuko adapting to being back in the Fire Nation, and the really fascinating dynamic with Azula, which is really, really interesting. But then you do get into, like, okay, you have the Blind Bandit and Zuko alone, which are very strong episodes, of course. I find the chase to be a little bit weaker, and then you're getting into more sort of like, okay, Aang learning earthbending, that's a kind of key episode. They did the learning the element episode much better than they did in Book 1, for sure. Then you have your sort of plot kicking into gear here. The library and the desert are fantastic. Serpent's Pass, really good. I have my criticisms of the drill, but, in general, the quality is pretty consistent here. City of Walls and Secrets is great, but then I would highlight these two episodes as being kind of a very interesting grouping of episodes. Individually, of course, they are unique in their own way, like Tales of Ba Sing Se. Wow, like an episode made up of multiple stories. Really, really cool. But a lot of them are hit and miss. A lot of people will hype it up because of the Tale of Iroh, but then completely ignore a lot of the other ones. And the fact that these two episodes are placed in the middle of your plot kicking into gear, 214 and the intrigue, what we learn about the inner workings of Ba Sing Se is so interesting. And to immediately basically just like cut from that to kind of fun times in the city for the most part, outside of the Tale of Momo sort of being a direct setup for Appa's Lost Days. It's an interesting kind of choice. And then especially Appa's Lost Days, to go into an episode like this that is just about Appa. Cool that they're giving the animal character an episode to himself, but it does take a little bit away that you do take a two episode break from this main plot, because 214 into Lake Laogai does work quite well. And then you'd say, like, okay, Earth King is maybe not the strongest episode, and then two great episodes to finish it off. So it's an interesting point in that you would still say that, like, okay, there's, say, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 episodes on the weaker end of things here in Book 3. But there's still kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 or 6 episodes in Book 2 that are sort of like equivalent. And then you have the other case of like that there's addressing the weaknesses of each book. What about the strengths of each book? And like I said, it's hard to argue with, the finale, one of the best two-parters in the series, one of the best solo episodes in the series, Zuko joining the group, dragons, Aang and Zuko learning fire, really good. So yeah, there's some discussion here in the chat about basically, the Tales of Ba Sing Se. Someone says Tales is top 5, I don't care. And that's the thing of like, why is it top 5 for you? Like, which specific aspects of that episode are you using to make it a top 5 episode? In the sense that, like, the Tale of Aang is just Aang messing around with animals. The Tale of Momo is ultimately just a setup for the Appa's Lost Days. The Sokka tale is nice in that it's like clever writing, but it is just Sokka, saying some poetry. The Tale of Toph and Katara is kind of important, I suppose, for their character development together. But again, it goes into the overall thing that the episode as a whole is not quite, what it needs to be at this point. And then you have like the Tale of Zuko is nice. But I do wish that they had actually maybe included going home again and aspects of what's going on there into book 2. So there's that, and that's where like I'm like, okay, like everyone's entitled to their opinion, of course. If you rank the episode in the top 5, go ahead. But I find it like a little bit much that like placing the episode there. Like I get having sort of your personal favorites, but that feels like a bit high, just because like the amount of good episodes. Like there's 3 parts of the finale: Boiling Rock, Southern Raiders, Crossroads of Destiny, The Guru, Siege of the North 1 and 2, The Storm. Like Tales of Ba Sing Se is better, and this will probably be controversial, but like even the Tale of Iroh, I don't think that tale has aged as well as as it probably maybe should have. And part of it comes down to the fact that it's very emotional for Iroh, but we also don't know anything about Liu Ten, and that has always been like a sticking point with me, especially in the last few years, in that like it's been so long since this episode initially aired, like nearly 15 years, give or take. We still don't know anything about Liu Ten, and so his character sort of just exists as, a character who died to, add to Iroh's character. And it's a good episode because it's nice to have that side moment with Iroh and show that he doesn't just help Zuko, he helps other people as well. But I think it just ends up being potentially one of the most overrated parts of Avatar, because everyone talks about it, that from this episode, like that moment, that tale, that was it, because it's emotional, because they also like tied in the death of Iroh's voice actor Mako into that as well. So it has that going for it, but from a character perspective, it's like, it's been all these years and we haven't quite got into it. What else do we have here from the chat? Okay, more rankings. I think the Tales of Ba Sing Se and Appa's Lost Days are some of the best episodes in the series. Again, it's one of those things where, like, yeah, from a personal perspective, I can see how someone could value them very, very highly. But again, like we are trying to do like a joint list here, and I don't tend to see too many people like really putting their neck out for like Appa's Lost Days. We have to really defend a high ranking for that. Let's see, book 3 is at the top because of the sheer amount of top tier episodes: Avatar and the Fire Lord, Invasion, every episode after Zuko joins the gang, and that is the thing with book 3. It's so hard to, I think, counter that. Just those how many episodes is this in a row? 3, 6, 9. Like, yeah, what all these episodes in a row here. The last like 12 episodes of the season. So there's that. It's hard to counter that. Plus, we can't be too dismissive of the episodes here. The Awakening is a good premiere. Like, it has a lot going on with regards to what Aang is dealing with, what Zuko's dealing with, even some nice Katara stuff, getting Hakoda to interact with a lot of the other characters and so on. The headband actually is quite important because, learning about the whole how the Fire Nation teaches its youth is very important. Yes, you wish they'd maybe come back to it, but it's also meant to highlight the gang finally get to the Fire Nation and travel through the Fire Nation and realize they're not fighting an entire nation of people. They're fighting the military, the leadership of this nation, not the people. And this is the episode to make that kind of clear. The townspeople that they come across are fine. Even the kids in the school are fine, outside of the fact that they're thought in a very, very specific way, lies basically about the history. The Painted Lady, I obviously personally like, because it's a fantastic Katara character episode, and the spiritual aspect to it that kind of comes in, but also just, you know, seeing like Katara actively at conflict with Sokka, and, you know, how they kind of work together at the end to kind of you know, save that town. It's stuff like that I think is quite kind of important in terms of like a general defense, even within the series, for these type of episodes. That, sure, if you go by Sokka's schedule, you skip going here, going there, going all these places just to get straight to the invasion. But the whole point of the series, going back to book 1, was that they met all these people along the way, here, even here, so that they had people at the invasion. And I think that's the point of Avatar, in a way, was that we had this incredible journey, that they met all these people, and when they called for aid, everyone answered, pretty much. So that's why I think the Painted Lady is kind of important. You know, Sokka's master, Sokka learning a skill that is so kind of valuable to him, that really takes him to the next level as a character. And, you know, finally you had an episode that highlighted, you know, Sokka's role within the group, how important it actually was for him. That's really good. You have the beach, I really like, because just getting to see the fire teens in a little bit more of a normal scenario, and especially the campfire scene at the end, where you learn so much in a short period of time about May, about Ty Lee, and about Azula, and even the Zuko bit of him, you know, erupting the campfire and saying, "I'm angry at myself." That is a really, really strong moment. And, you know, for Azula, in terms of like a redemption arc, you have to cite this episode and some of the things that happen with her in this episode as being like, this is why this episode is important. Just getting that other side of Azula that you kind of don't see almost anywhere else, outside of some of the vulnerabilities towards the finale, where she's like dealing with the hallucinations of her mother. Avatar and the Fire Lord is just impressive, of course. There's not too much to say there, but what I will say is just that it's impressive that they left this story, how this 100-year war even started, and they left it until a decent bit into Book 3 Fire to explain it. And here we go, it works. And the way they tell it, Aang is told a lot of this by Roku. Zuko learned some of it from the Dragonbone Catacombs, and then the rest from Iroh. It's so well done from both sides, of just Aang gaining this understanding of, you know, an Avatar and the Fire Lord used to be friends. An Avatar and the Fire Lord could be friends. And on Zuko's side of things, realizing that, like, oh, this explains this, like, my lineage explains a lot of my struggles. And what a moment that is. Like, that is probably one of the most sort of, like, the moment I love to watch people react to on, like, in reaction videos, is reacting to the reveal that Zuko's related to Roku. Like, that's how strong that moment is. The Runaway, I'm not the, like, biggest fan of, but it's still nice to sort of get, you basically say the resolution, for the most part, of the Toph and Katara conflict. I'd say the only criticism that's really particularly valid here is just that she sends the message off with Hawkeye and we don't really hear about it. So it's sort of a plot point they bring up but don't really kind of come back to. Thankfully the comics addressed some of Toph and her parents, but there's still a little bit more to do. Puppet Master is really strong. It's one of those episodes where I struggle to rate it like super highly, but it's such a unique episode in what it does in terms of, it's the only like horror themed episode, you would say. So there's that. And then yeah, this all sort of speaks for itself, as we talked about. And then let's kind of do the same kind of run through here with book 2 just before we decide it. The Avatar State, like I said, good opener. But it is interesting that the whole Avatar State plot really only comes up like in like 1 or 2 episodes. It's brought up here, and then we really only properly come back to it like all the way down here. Like they get the letter about the guru here. Patik is obviously introduced here, and then the guru of Crossroads of Destiny are where it's sort of dealt with. Again, I wouldn't be too critical of that because, you know, it is a plot point in book 2, but it's not like the whole plot is about the Avatar State. It's just not. You would have to say, though, like, obviously you have this kind of early section here where Aang's looking for an earthbending master, and then you obviously get this to have it actually happen. And then him actually learning earthbending here. Then with the library, you get the start of the kind of bigger plot, which is obviously, you know, learning about the eclipse to set up Book 3 Fire, of course, the organization of the main plan to actually win the war, and then transitioning into, but to fully plan it, we need to go to Ba Sing Se, and we get the whole Ba Sing Se conspiracy plot. Now, the thing with the Ba Sing Se conspiracy plot is just that it's all about how much you value this sort of political intrigue of, like, if you think this is one of the top 10 episodes, which I can definitely see, I think previously, a few years ago, I did have this episode quite high up. You can definitely be like, yeah, this is one of the strongest episodes of book 2 because it sets so much into motion. And like I said, I think it's let down a little bit just by, you know, we get all this stuff introduced and then break for 2 episodes. And then we come back to it really strongly, and like Lagai is fantastic. Earth King is also, you know, very good. Like Zuko's metamorphosis and what happens there is really interesting to consider because he's like, so he is basically all but ready to just move on from his whole like destiny that he thinks and just kind of settle down in the Earth Kingdom. But Azula, of course, draws him back in, and then like the Guru and Crossroads of Destiny are just fantastic. Like I said, to me, book 2 and 3 comes down to like the strong episodes versus the strong episodes. I think book 3 Fire has more immediately stand out super strong episodes than book 2 does. You could say that like maybe book 3 Fire has maybe like 1 or 2 more episodes than book 2 does that are sort of more on the not as memorable side of things, but it's not like book 2 doesn't have its sort of its equivalent Painted Lady headband style episodes. In terms of like the Cave of Two Lovers is very much a fortune teller style episode, and it's good because, you know, they have like that lore to it as well. You have you know, the swamp, I like a lot of the spiritual stuff, so the swamp I actually find like to be a really interesting episode. Avatar Day gets pretty heavily criticized despite, you know, the Kyoshi love that's always been around, but even more so now. This is the Kyoshi backstory. So there's that. So there's that going on. But yeah, like you have these kind of character episodes and here. And this is where like book 2 does have the benefit of being able to introduce a new main character. It actually has the benefit of 2 new main characters, which is obviously like Azula pretty much and Toph. Whereas book 3 doesn't really get that opportunity necessarily. You do have the, you know, you could say like Ozai, I suppose, but you know, there's not really too much there. But what are people saying in the chat? Let's see. Yeah, still some more discussion about the Tales of Ba Sing Se. Episode where you can take a break. And look, yeah, you need a break every so often. I just think at that point in book 2, you've literally just been introduced to the Ba Sing Se conspiracy plot, and immediately you're sort of putting it to the side. Now, I get it. Within the plot of 214, they create the idea that effectively they're being handled so much in the city they can't do anything, but it still doesn't feel great that, you know, you have a 2-episode break. And a 2-episode break with sort of more experimental episodes. That's sort of the point that I'm making. Let's see, yeah, Conspiracy, Plot, and Bossing Say is probably one of the best plots in the franchise. And yeah, kind of pretty much. Let's see, when it comes to ATLA rankings, 1, 3, 2. What order is that in? I'm not even sure. Because I don't think anyone was arguing for book 1 is number 1. So I'm guessing it's kind of reverse order. So 1 is 3, 3 is 2, and 2 is 1. I'm surprised no one is arguing Zuko alone for top 10. I believe I have it, if I remember my list correctly, I believe it's number 12 on my list. And look, I know it's an episode people really, really like. For me, the only thing that brings Zuko alone down is probably just the fact that there is more to come from that story. And I do value quite highly a lot of the content that we got from the search that applies directly to add on to that episode. And I kind of feel like maybe some of that stuff could have been actually introduced in that episode. But otherwise, you know, it's a strong episode. You know, all the alone episodes are really, really good. And hopefully Suki alone is keeps the trend going. But, you know, I struggle a little bit with it just being, you know, like, you know, people making the argument that, like, it for a lot of people should be absolutely a top 5, absolutely a top 10, just because I think there are stronger episodes. It's one of those things where, like, it's placed at a very interesting point in Zuko's journey, and I think maybe if it was that backstory was told at a different point, you might have got more out of the episode. But again, that's just really getting into the kind of details of things. So yeah, at least for me, so there's my opinion on it. For, like, this is why, like, book 3 ahead of book 2, because to me, I haven't seen anyone in the comments especially counter basically just this, like, counter that string of incredible episodes. Are we counting the multi-part episodes as one? Well, in the context of what we're doing here, creating a ranking of the books, it doesn't actually matter. But when I do my lists, I do always separate the episodes out. That's just why I have that kind of going on here in terms of, like, you know, Boiling Rock Part 1 and Part 2. These Part 1 and Part 2. You know, when I was doing the discussion on the top 10s, of course, there are individual episodes always. But then you do have stuff like, what is it? These two are actually technically a 2-parter called, like, what is it, like Secrets of the Fire Nation or something like that. I think there's 2 actual kind of multi-part names on this episode. So, you know, it's one of those things where in this discussion it doesn't matter too much. So there's that. But yeah, so far what I'm seeing, it's mainly just been like, yeah, you have to acknowledge the strength of book 3. The criticism is, like, kind of this run of episodes here. But the reverse of that is, of course, okay, like, book 2 has its strong episodes, but, you know, there's more gaps, I think, here, and there's maybe not as many that stand out. Just obviously, in my opinion, based on the number of yellows compared to number of reds, it just highlights that book 2 is the middle book, and that's its position for me, at the very least. But yeah, that's the situation there. So I don't know. I from what I've seen in chat, I think it is this. But again, it's close. That's the point here. Like we did with all the bending lists and stuff like this, it's always a super close decision. It's never going to be easy between these two. It's always going to be the main debate with Avatar, book 3 or book 2, because I don't think there's much of a discussion with book 1. But yeah, we'll move into Korra at this point. So this is where it's going to be tricky for me, because I know I have a sort of different view on things than a lot of other people do. In that, like, of course, my personal list is this, which I don't think is necessarily what a lot of people agree with. Now, that said, there are people out there, like, people do like book 2. It's just that it's a more kind of minority opinion, but it's one of those things. The question really comes down to here is, like, obviously we're doing this with the chat, so I'm not going to be able to argue for book 2 spirits being number 1 here. I know that going into this straight away. I know that that's the case. There are probably a few people who back up that opinion, but it's not going to be enough to get a book 2. I think for me, the main argument that I would make is really just that, I suppose that we'll just go through it here. I agree with book spirits is underrated, but why is your ranking for book 3 so low? Like I've explained many times before, my problem with book 3, and I suppose we'll bring it up here as the kind of big thing, because this is where I think, like, overrated opinions on people who have overrated opinions on Korra, it is that book 3, for I think a lot of people, is the default opinion for the number 1 slot when it comes to Korra books, and that I just don't agree with at all. So for one, you can see from my opinions here, not a single episode here that I rate in the top 10, and then we have 1 episode in the bottom 5. So it's not too bad in terms of, like, the quality of episodes is not like it's super low. It's not like you're seeing red bars all over the place or anything like that. It's kind of spread out in Korra quite a bit. But again, you're not seeing too many yellow bar episodes, which are top 10 episodes. And for me, what ends up happening here is that you have this interesting plot here of, like, okay, Korra is banished from the city and has to go find this kind of new path, which is going to help Tenzin to restore the airbenders. Cool. In the background, you had the Red Lotus escaping from prison. Korra and the Red Lotus don't encounter each other until this episode. And then she doesn't learn about the details of the Red Lotus until this episode. And then the dynamic is basically just that they want to kill her because they view the Avatar as a world leader of sorts, and because they are Red Lotus like Unalaq, they of course support Vatu over Rava, so they want chaos instead of peace. So part of it is just that I don't think Korra has much of a character arc in book 3, whereas she does have a character arc properly in book 1, in book 2, and in book 4. But Korra feels a little bit, outside of her initial decision here, a little bit like a passenger throughout most of book 3, where they wait so long to reveal any details about the Red Lotus that when it finally comes out, you're like, is that it? Like, is that all you're going to tell us? It's just that it's an offshoot of the White Lotus and these 4 characters are part of it. Oh, and by the way, Unalaq was also part of it. And there's so much telling instead of showing. Because it's a group of 4 villains, it feels very imbalanced between the 4, in that Zahir is, like, all the way up here, and then the other 3 are sort of down here, like Pali maybe somewhere in the middle because we know a little bit more about her. But Minghua and Ghazan are just, like, they're basically just their combat abilities, because their personality comes out in, like, maybe 2 or 3 scenes in the entire run, because they're both killed in the book. And it's just that example of, like, okay, the Red Lotus as a concept, I'll always say, is really, really interesting. But I don't think it's explored all that well within book 3. Because again, you're only properly introduced to the concept of the Red Lotus here. And you don't get time to properly, like, in your head establish what's going on, because he's just talking about, like, Zhai Bao didn't like what was going on, so we formed the Red Lotus, and I'm part of it now. Unalaq was part of it. These 3 are part of it. And, like, why? Why are you part of it? In that, like, okay, you don't agree with the White Lotus going public and supporting the Avatar in the way that you do, but you personally feel that way, and then it gets a little bit muddled between, like, they're trying to be the same philosophy as Unalaq, which is the case. The only thing Unalaq does different than the Red Lotus is that him becoming the Dark Avatar was not in the Red Lotus plan. So the question is like the whole world leader thing. Is that a Zahir specific thing or a Red Lotus specific thing? And it feels like it's more of a Zahir thing, but the implication seems to be that they all kind of feel that way. But then it obviously comes up. Why are any of these four members a part of this group? Because it is an organization. It's not just that, Kuvira wants to do this thing with the Earth Kingdom. Amon wants to get rid of bending because of what happened in his past. Unalaq wants to restore the spirits because the world isn't spiritual. Their plot and character is about the organization that they're a part of. And I don't think we explore the organization well enough, and I don't think we explore them as individuals well enough. Look, okay, Zahir is the leader. You get why he's in it. Okay, fine. He is a peer of Unalaq, and I guess he was maybe second in command at that point of the Red Lotus, and now he's in charge with Unalaq dead. That, I guess, makes sense, even if we don't know the full kind of reasons behind it, necessarily. But the other three, Pali, Ghazan, and Minghua, what about them as characters explain why they're part of a group that hates world leaders? And this is where what you needed really badly was some sort of explanation for why each of them hates world leaders. You actually kind of get it for Pali, even though it's one line of dialogue and you really wish they'd expand on it more, which is that they say that Pali was held like captive, like used as an assassin by a warlord on a fire island, and Zahir rescued her from that. So she's kind of just going along with Zahir because of their romantic connection. He saved her. But like, tell us about that. Like a fire island, warlords in this modern era of Avatar. That's very interesting. But no, it's just we're told about it. It's the exact same with the whole, oh yeah, Korra, you were nearly kidnapped by the Red Lotus when you were younger, shortly after you were discovered as the Avatar. Let us tell you about this amazing conflict that happened where like Tenzin, Sokka, Zuko, and Tonraq fought Ghazan, Pali, Minghua, and Zahir with no bending. No, you don't want to hear about that? Okay, let's move on. It's like, really? Is that's fine, I guess. Okay. Not knowing about this thing that Sokka was involved in, it's just baffling. And there's so much of that. And that's my problem, is that the books of Korra, to me, are so focused on the villain of the book and what they allow the plot to sort of be. And I just have so many questions with book 3 when it comes to the villains. Whereas I felt like by the end of book 1, I in general had a foundation with Amon. That his backstory, because we were shown it, was effective enough. Even though it's only a 7-minute backstory in K111, Skeletons in the Closet, it's effective enough just by itself to explain to you why this character, despite being a bender, why he is motivated to be anti-bender. And in doing so, explain like, oh, he can be defeated not by being overpowered with his abilities, but by being outed as a bender to non-benders. And that's the thing. Yeah, that's exactly the thing with book 3. Book 3 had the most potential, and that is the key word, potential. I would love, and I've done videos on this in the past. Like, I think it's one of my more popular videos, actually. It's a video I did called Developing the Red Lotus, where, sure, I brought up the criticisms that I've been talking about here, but in the framework of, you can make these characters so much more interesting if you just develop them and give them their backstories. In that, like I've said many times before, Minghua, just make her backstory have a reason why she doesn't like world leaders. Which water tribe is she from? We know she was born without arms, so was she refused bending training because of that? That would be a reason. And then maybe Unalaq, as a waterbender, found her, trained her, brought her into the Red Lotus, and that explains Ming-Hua. A simple way, using a few connections, to explain Ming-Hua, a character who has very little to her. With Ghazan, we learn two things about him. Bolin says 3 things. One of them's a lie. 2 of them are truths. Raised by an older sister. Mustache grew in when he was like really young. And the other thing is... I completely forget what the other thing is. I usually have this right on top of my head. And the crush, the potential developing relationship between Ghazan and Ming-Hua. Like, obviously the whole mustache thing, I feel, isn't really perhaps a thing. So that's why I lean towards the maybe Ming-Hua attraction actually being the case. But either way, the important one is the one that is obviously true, which is raised by an older sister. What happened to his parents? How does his lava bending affect him growing up? Where's he from in the Earth Kingdom? Or, is he maybe a early Republic City guy? Or, that sort of thing. There's a few questions that you would have there just on the basis of what is clearly shown about his character, even though there's no depth to it. Police obviously explains itself with regards to just flesh out the story that we were told in dialogue, but by actually showing it and the details of that. But it also highlights that even Zahir as the leader needs development, because they don't ever really explain why he dislikes world leaders so much. Like, it's cool. He's into airbender culture. He's into kind of philosophy. He's really into Guru Lahima. But, as we know, Guru Lahima is more of a sort of kind of like almost out there thinker. He's not your typical air nomad. So you can't initially just say that he knows everything about like air nomad culture. It's more of he's into the main philosophers in history, and that's kind of interesting. So what was this guy like as a non-bender fighter? What drove him? Where's he from? Those type of things. Just the motivation. You get the motivation for the other villains in the other books, but they sort of mask over it in book 3 with Red Lotus, White Lotus. That's all you need to know. So that's the thing, because otherwise, if you look at the other plots going on in book 3, I love the return of the Airbenders. I really like that plot. A Breath of Fresh Air, Rebirth, original Airbenders. I think the only thing that would have made original Airbenders better is if they waited to do this episode until Opal had actually arrived, so that way you get Opal's development as an Airbender within the group. I would have loved to have seen like her initial like dynamic with Kai, her initial kind of meeting Janora and everyone. That would have really been cool. It's just a little unfortunate that by the time she arrives, she's just one of the captives as we get into the sort of finales type situation. The Old Wounds Metal Clan, the kind of subplot with Su Yin and Lin, and a little bit of the backstory with Toph, really, really good. Like, I think book 3 gets its side plots right. Book 3 does a lot that is really good in the background of like, subtly introducing us to Kuvira ahead of book 4. That's nice. That's really good. And Korra's sacrifice and it building into an arc for Korra in book 4 is good. Not to mention Janora getting to really stand out as you go through the book. I love that arc for Janora, seeing her get to stand out and by the end get her tattoos. I also really like Kai and her relationship with Kai, and I think they do such good work with that in the likes of original Airbenders, and even with Kai into the finale and his sort of sacrifice that he nearly makes. That's all good. The same goes for, I think, even though I'm critical of the character side of the Red Lotus, some of the world building aspects of it, I like that book 3 has some of the best fights in the series. That it is kind of, for the most part, bender on bender combat, and we don't get as much of that in Korra as you maybe would expect. I just wish there was more behind it. So there's that. There's that. This is an interesting comment. I believe book 3 is rated highly due to the lack of frustration with the romance stuff and the main group feeling like a team through the whole adventure. I ultimately would agree with this, because a lot of the fandom tends to, I think, really heavily kind of look for the romance stuff and view all of it as being frustrating. Whereas, to me, I actually am not frustrated by that much of the romance stuff in Korra, in the sense of, like, in book 1 when it gets introduced, it's very much in the background, and it's only really in the spotlight in, like, this episode. And once they get through 105, it's a handful of scenes as we go through it. And while, yes, I agree with the criticism that in general the romance writing in Korra until, like, right at the end was much more focused on the drama than actual, like, character connections through romance, and that's a problem. I think it's a little over exaggerated in the sense that, like, what does it say about book 3 that, you know, going down that path, the thing that makes book 3 stand out is just that it doesn't have this, like, 2% of the book, a couple of romance little moments. To me, it's just that the writing was a little bit better with the romance in book 3, because the only romance I suppose they really dealt with in book 3 was Pali and Zahir, which, you know, I guess works for what it is. We get some explanation for it, but again, the backstory would have been fantastic to develop that more. And then Bolin and Opal and Jinora and Kai, and they work because they don't really focus on drama too much. There's initially a thing where, like, Opal's not the usual girl kind of that Bolin goes for, but they get over that really quickly. The same with sort of Kai and Jinora. It happens. They're not trying to create all these, like, dynamics and stuff like that. I think they learned their lesson from Korra overall, to not forcibly try to make shipping wars a thing in the show. To just, if you want romance, do it, commit to it, and just have it happen. There's no need to, like, hold back on it, or and try and force, like, the shipping sort of discussion stuff that you had before. It just, to me, it doesn't work. So, and again, even in book 2, where I think it gets kind of, like, the worst of it, which is why I think the 205, 206 are the weaker book 2 episodes, it's still confined to here for the most part. There's a little bit of argument between, like, Mako and Korra here, but it really only comes to a forefront, like, here. I think the biggest problem is, like, what on earth were the writers thinking, trying to do by having Mako get back together with Asami? Because ultimately, I don't think many people connected too strongly with that relationship when it happened. And they actually made Makora work towards the end of book 1. And then they just decided, like, nah, we're not happy with it, and they just went their separate ways with it. Yes, it was I think the romance was kind of messy in book 2. But it's a handful of scenes in these episodes, and then, like, 1 or 2 scenes in these episodes kind of here. So that's the kind of thing here. It's just that, like, you know, as we transition from the first 2 books into the second 2 books, it feels like there is a writing change that is better on some sides and worse on others. But there's that. That's an interesting point. I think Zahir has an appeal because he doesn't want power for himself, but to free everyone from it. It is an interesting one. I know a lot of people tend to really latch onto, like, the Zahir kind of philosophy is kind of really interesting and intriguing. I think the problem that I've always had with it is that it ends up feeling a little kind of silly in the grand scheme of things, that, like, he really couldn't predict that if he, like, that things would happen to rise up to stop what he did from happening. And that, you know, the whole chaos across the world is never really a thing that kind of necessarily works. So there's that. So it's just one of those kind of unfortunate things where, like, the presentation of Zahir, even towards the end, like, why did they have that scene right at the end where Zahir, when defeated, like, literally acts like a madman, and then Bolin, like, actually puts a sock in his mouth? I get that we're sort of going for the whole, you know, make fun of Ozai after he's defeated thing, but given that you were trying to get across is that Zahir actually has this, like, philosophy that makes you think, it suddenly turned it into a joke. And, you know, I think this is why I'd always say Zahir's best scenes are the scenes with Zahir in book 4. Anytime, I think if we ever go back to Zahir, that's going to be the most interesting stuff with him. I like him as the sort of kind of dark side guru guy who just is in prison. He's happy in prison because he can meditate into the spirit world whenever he wants. He's in prison, but he's free to a degree as well. So that's kind of always an interesting dynamic. But yeah, there's that. So in the middle of all this, yeah, we started out with the big book 3 discussion, and I presented my positives on it and the weaknesses of it. So that's why I say it comes up for me, because we'll do book 4 next, to get into you know, the problems here. Like I said on my personal list, I've moved book 4 down to being my personal weakest book of Korra. And the reason for that is because when I think about this book, what are the things that stand out to me as being the main positives from it? One, obviously, is Korra's recovery arc. I really like that recovery arc. Now, obviously, it isn't the complete focus of the whole book, in that, like, it's covered in episodes like Korra Alone, of course. The Calling covers some of it. Beyond the Wilds covers some of it. And of course you have her, like, failed return here, the battle against Kuvira, which is part of it, but it's from a character perspective point of view. It's like those sort of 3 episodes, really. The problem that I have with book 4 is that, and I think it's almost like a bigger problem than the Red Lotus backstory not being given or being presented particularly well. It's that Kuvira is your villain that you set up in book 3. So Kuvira straight away is a very different character in book 4 than she is in book 3. That needs to be explained, how that change happened. And pretty much the book doesn't explain it. The book does not develop Kuvira as a character well enough to fully make me get behind her in book 4. And when I rewatched it last, I was so shocked that, in my mind, Kuvira's arc has to be saved by the moment with Korra in the spirit world at the very end of the book. That conversation between those two in the spirit world saves the book from having, in my mind, a pretty weak character motivation arc for Kuvira. It's still not great because there's so much of, wait, Kuvira, why did you, like, betray the family that, you know, effectively raised you? What is going on here? Like, there's so many, like, weird moments that don't kind of fit with everything going on, because like, Su Yin attempts to assassinate Kuvira at a certain point, and it just feels so out of the blue, given that this is your adopted mother. And especially with what we know now from Runes of the Empire, the comic, which still doesn't give us all of the answers. So it's one of those really weird things where, like, the Red Lotus fulfill their role within book 3 fine, even without having all that backstory. Their backstory would have taken it to the next level, and book 3 for me might have been number 1 or number 2. With Kuvira, I think there are fundamental problems brought into the book because so much of the details of what she's about are left vague and unexplored. This is the book where you absolutely needed to fully show the backstory of how Kuvira, Su Yin's adopted daughter, captain of her guard, how that character who saved Tonrock in book 3 becomes the great uniter. It is not enough to literally just have an argument where Su Yin does not want to be the new ruler of the... no, I can't criticize Su Yin too much for not wanting to take on that role that they ask her to, the world leaders ask her to. And the fact that like Kuvira takes that as like an utter betrayal, so much so that the family connection that they have goes out the window. You needed much, much more than that. And especially because there is so much sort of implied like intent behind what Kuvira does, that she takes Batar with her. She takes a lot of the higher ups who agree with her from Zhao Fu. She really like rips a kind of group out of Zhao Fu, all kind of in a way just because Su Yin didn't have the same views as her. But it's like, where did those views come from? And it's interesting because the career stuff from Ruins of the Empire does help to explain some of this, but it also adds it adds nuance to the situation for sure, because the way the ending scene works with Kuvira and Korra makes it feel like very much this is a tragic character. She was an orphan and she doesn't want anyone to ever feel the way she felt when her parents kind of left her. It feels a little bit weird looking at it now, because you actually see that like Kuvira had like behavioral problems effectively. Like she nearly like badly injured her parents, and her parents, just being non-benders, couldn't deal with her. And so it's like, okay, I get it, you know, from her perspective it still is the case, you know, her parents sort of abandoned her, but they were also the ones who, I suppose, made sure to turn her over to someone who could better handle her. So it's like, okay, it just doesn't kind of work that well for me in my mind. And the other thing here is like getting into some of the other plots. Like, I'll always say that book 4, again, it saved Wu right at the end. Wu actually becoming a solid leader at the end of book 4 and into the comics saved that character, saved that plot from the early book 4 stuff. It still doesn't take away the fact that it's not the most interesting, entertaining content. That Mako, a character who has not been treated well since like his proven to be right moment from book 2, really, in a way, outside of fights, is just... Lin is just like, sorry Mako, you deal with this annoying character and, you know, go from there. And it's like, okay, cool, this dynamic is kind of interesting between these two, but it's not really what we want Mako doing as a character. In the final book, Wu is not really the character we want getting in the way of our reunion episode type thing. So there's problems like that I think that come into play. So it's kind of unfortunate there. I suppose there's a bit of a discussion going on in the chat here about the idea of when we're viewing this here, should we always incorporate what we know from the comics that came after book 4 into book 4? To me, I don't think you have to. I think in this specific scenario where we are making a list of the books, I think you have to focus on, yes, what is here. yeah, you can bring in some of the stuff from the comics, what we learned afterwards, but I don't think that should make a fundamental shift, in the sense that, you know, it is a major criticism of Book 4 that Kuvira is underdeveloped. And the comic added more, for sure, and I love that comic. It just didn't add everything else. It's a weird one, because people criticized Runes of the Empire harder than a lot of the recent Avatar comics. And I felt it was kind of a little bit unfair criticism, because it felt like they were basically applying that Book 4 criticism, which is that Book 4 doesn't develop Kuvira enough, to Runes of the Empire. The book that makes an effort to develop Kuvira. They're applying all this stuff that actually is a criticism of Book 4 onto the comic. And that I don't kind of like. But I do feel in this context it is fair to keep the criticism of that stuff had to be told later. In the same way that, like, I'd still criticize ATLA as a series for not having anything with Toph and her parents. Like, it does feel weird when the book ends and there's a clear setup of a plot, but there was no plan in place to actually cover that plot. So, you know, the whole idea of, like, where's my mother at the end of ATLA? Toph and her parents. They are unexplored plot points talking just about the series. Now we have answers, but it's still a criticism of the show as a medium that it didn't have those in there initially. So that's why, like, I'm going in a little bit more on Book 4 here, and that, like, look, it's fantastic. I like what they added in with Kuvira, but it doesn't fix all of the problems, in that it still is weirdly presented, that they only mention, like, maybe once or twice in the whole book that, like, Su Yin is Kuvira's, like, mother. So some of that stuff, to communication wise to the audience, didn't come across particularly well. Another point about Book 4 that I'd say is a bit of a criticism for me is that I don't think they did the reunion of the team after all these years that well. I think Reunion as an episode isn't that good, unfortunately. One, you know, the fact that the three of them reunite, and then there's a mission with Wu, basically. Wu's kidnapped. That's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate that is the case. I get what they were going for. There's some awkwardness between the group as they reunite, and by fighting together they get back together properly. But this gets into some of the sort of Korra-Sami vague setup situation stuff of, like, it's messy. It's messy. It's a little all over the place what they're expecting you to take from these dynamics, in that, you know, they really don't properly commit to Korra-Sami until the moment right at the end. So you're not really thinking about it too much here outside of the blush scene, and you're kind of working to kind of explain that in your head. And while sure you can interpret the whole, like, why did you reply to her messages but not mine situation, and that's just kind of needless kind of relationship drama stuff again, of, like, really, like, your best friend and a Sami who a relationship is beginning to develop, you know, that's the same sort of relationship kind of drama. So that's that. And I've never been that big of a fan of that episode. Remembrances, of course, is always going to be a major criticism of Book 4. Like, seriously, like, remembrances in Book 4. Look, there are reasons why this episode happened. It's down to the budget. They chose being loyal to their crew and keeping the crew on for longer, as opposed to just, you know, what happened and so on. It's an awkward situation. You know, it is awkward what happened. It still doesn't defend the fact that this episode stands out across both series as being this incredibly weak episode. I just am amazed that this is an episode of the show, because it tries to do something kind of interesting in terms of like, let's do Mako's recap and then Korra's recap and then Bolin's recap. But I think they get it wrong. The Mako one is all about relationship drama. And it's basically the thing that I absolutely hate in Korra when it comes to the romance drama, is that the writers effectively laid it all at Mako. And we had to have the Mako is awkward around people arc in Turf Wars basically because of this. And I didn't like that the Mako recap was not about sort of the strengths of the characters or the major plots that he was involved in. No, it was about the relationship stuff. And that just didn't work for me. The Korra section, I think, is just dull. Like, it's just really, really dull. I don't think they do much with it. It's just a very standard recap that she's still in the middle of her recovery. She's going to roughly get to the next stage of her recovery in the next episode, but we're not really doing much here. The Korra section of this episode should have been the Korrasami moment. You should have done more Korrasami stuff here than they actually did. Instead, the dialogue is very plain between Korra and Asami here, very standard, and it's just like, there you go. There's the explanation on a lot of the Korrasami stuff. It's just that they knew they had to keep it subtle, almost too subtle, and they only really committed to it right at the end, and stuff like that ends up being missed opportunities. The Bolin Varric section, I think, is interesting in the sense of, like, yes, it's funny and some of it's clever, but they also take away Bolin getting a proper recap because Varric takes over. That it's less about Bolin and what he gets up to, and it's more about Varric's craziness, and it just happens to kind of, present Bolin as a hero, like, a little bit, when Bolin actually has, probably after Korra and Tenzin, like, probably one of the best character arcs in the show, with his book 2 arc, even his book 3 arc, and what they've done so far in book 4. Like, it is quite notable what Bolin goes through, and I don't like that it's just like crazy movers stuff in the episode. So I just don't think it accomplished that much. And as the sort of recap, calm before the storm of the ending of the series, it did nothing resembling Ember Island Players. Nothing resembling episodes like that we've had before. So there's that. And look, they did their best to play around with it and make it more fun and stuff like that, but I can't place any episode of Korra or Avatar below Remembrances. It just is this low bar on the bottom of the episode of the series that I just I'd be shocked if, like, any episode of the Avatar franchise as we go forward ever ends up lower than this. That's the kind of situation of it. So there's that. Yeah. And then, look, a lot of this stuff, like, I really like 409. 409, I think, is really good with the Zahir stuff and Korra, the final section of Korra's growth and stuff like that. You have stuff like Kuvira's Gambit and, like, the Baatar dynamic with Kuvira was interesting, but again, explain that. Like, how did that relationship come about? Because they're effectively part of the same family, like, was this a relationship that was always on the verge of blossoming, or did it, like, literally just happen as a response to the disagreement between Suyin and Kuvira? Stuff like that, I think, gets in the way of just, like, exactly what they're going for. Now, I do appreciate that with the comic, they've committed to the idea that Kuvira does love Baatar, that they do both really, really care about each other, that this probably will be, an endgame relationship. So I like that. It's just, it was interesting to see the way it was presented, as you don't know if she actually cares about him, and I don't think that should have necessarily been the case. So there's that. And then, the final fight, yes, you can criticize it a little bit for like the majority of the main fight being either the Colossus versus everyone else, or the main fight having to be a very close quarters battle inside of the Colossus. Whereas I maybe would have preferred a more straight up rematch of Battle of Zaofu, of just the two of them going at each other properly, just to see what that would look like. Obviously, Korra would not want to use the Avatar state initially. She'd want to sort of get the win on her own. It worked, there's some nice choreography as it is, but not my favorite, Korra versus villain fight, of course. And it ends relatively nicely. It sets up some of the stuff that they've explored in Ruins of the Empire. It's just, I think it gets very messy around the middle. And even some of the stuff right at the start, when they probably should have explained a lot of the Kavira stuff, that's where I think was more of the problem. Let's see, what's this comment here? I think that book 2 has a way too Western philosophy. The spirits are either good or bad, whereas in ATLA the spirits weren't that black or white. They had a grey morality similar to yin and yang. Did they? I thought Heibai was pretty clear that here he is in his dark form, here he is in his light form. It seemed pretty simple with that. And I don't really mind too much that Avatar commits to the light, its philosophy on light and dark being the way it is. I think the whole grey is a bit boring, because it's just like, oh, so the balance is just utilizing both. That's fine, but I think there's just as much value in trying to find the correct balance of, is balance just no darkness, given the philosophy of each side? That when light is in the ascendancy, it doesn't seek to actively spread, but darkness always seeks to spread. No matter how small or big it is, it always seeks to consume everything, and that is Vatu's nature. That's the nature of darkness in Avatar. So how can you have a proper balance if you try and keep something that's always going to, at 50-50, try and consume the other, whereas light is always going to commit to 50-50? That's always been my view on it, which I suppose is effectively the same as what they roughly are committing to in like Star Wars, with the Force, and like what balance of the Force within Star Wars is. It's not the idea of a grey Jedi necessarily. It's light, but light doesn't necessarily have to be the exact Jedi philosophy, Spirit bending. I've always liked spirit bending as a concept, because it highlights something that, characters in the physical world have to combat spirits who are otherwise just net more powerful by default, because they're effectively immortal and so on. Whereas spirit bending actually created a way for spiritual people to, one, if they do encounter a dark spirit, to restore a balance to them, so that they aren't this chaotic entity always seeking to spread darkness around, and go back to being neutral, effectively, which is just, basically light or neutral, like not trying to spread it around. Not to mention, it introduces a way to actively destroy a spirit with the dark version of spirit bending, which I think is actually quite important to create sort of a absolute final death for someone or something, that you can actually like destroy a spirit. That reincarnation seems to be the way everything works in Avatar. This is a way to stop reincarnation by destroying a spirit. So that's an interesting idea that spirit bending introduces. And just in general, I like kind of these techniques that it's a spiritual technique for water, and there are spiritual techniques for some of the other nations as well. That fire has a kind of spirit sensory technique that can also, heal sort of spiritual corruption to a degree. And then Janora's airbending technique, the astral projection and the control she has over it is pretty cool. So, yeah, there's book 4. I'll actually talk about book 1 next. To me, book 1 is so solid as a book. And I think it for sure, it's the most sort of consistent book start to finish, where the only real problems I think with book 1 are that, one, yes, the romance is a little messy, but as I've explained, I don't think it takes up enough time in the book that disliking the romance completely brings the whole book down, because I don't think that it's covered in enough scenes to be that prevalent that it just takes over the whole thing. The second thing is just a little bit of lack of explanation right at the end. I every time I watch Endgame, I can't believe that Katara or someone doesn't explain what Amon actually does to remove bending. Because if they just gave some sort of an explanation, that would explain so much. Basically, he is a super powerful bloodbender. He blocked your bending with bloodbending. I can't fix it because I'm not powerful enough to bloodbend that way. That, we know what the problem is. We just can't we just can't counter what he's done because he was such an incredible bender. It gets over even more of how impressive Amon was, while also explaining that, what's wrong with Korra isn't utterly insurmountable. If there is a way, there is a way for it to be fixed, and one of those ways is, her connecting with her past lives and energy bending, fixing her energy network. So that's always been a major criticism for me, that the fact that the creators were perfectly willing to, in interviews, say that this is what it was, this is how it worked. You should have just had that in the show. I get they don't like explaining complicated things, but the second you revealed Amon was a bloodbender, and that bloodbending is the core to what he is doing, I just felt like you needed to explain that this is what he's doing. Just a little bit of a step further, and that would have fixed everything. But again, it's a minor point. I think compared to a lot of the other villains, just missing that point, and perhaps when did he meet Hiroshi, doesn't matter as much, because we got the main thing. So there's that. And yeah, I've never had the criticism of that I've seen a lot about the book 1 ending, which is that it was so easy for Korra, she was just given back her bending. Why wasn't the whole show about Korra relearning the elements? And that's where I'm always why do we want Korra to just be Avatar again? She already knows water bending, earth bending, and fire bending. Why does she have to relearn it again? I've never understood that criticism, and that's the way it should go. And it just feels we have Avatar. If you want to see an Avatar do that, watch Avatar. Why does Korra need to do that? Because in unlocking airbending, she unlocks the spiritual aspect of herself. So there's that. So to me, that's the thing with book 1 is I as it says here, this run of episodes. I'll actually go as far as to say this run of episodes here, 106 all the way to 111, absolutely incredible. With really 105 being the only sort of episode you would say is really in any way properly weak. Because the opening episode is very strong. 2 is probably the second weakest episode. 3 is fantastic. 4 is a great character piece with Korra's fear. And even 105, given that it's the weakest of the book, it's still quite well written with how they incorporate the issues all out of the arena, the romance issues, the dynamic between the teams, how they affect the team when they're in the matches. That when Bolin thinks things are going great with Korra, he's the MVP in the match. When things are going good for Korra, she's doing really well. But when the romance stuff starts to affect them, it affects them on the court as well. So that's I really do like how that works, and I think that's what to me saves a lot of the romance stuff. It's why I don't hate it in book one, because it handles it. Book one handles the drama pretty well, in that it never goes too far out of the way with things that, like, you're just like, what are you doing? At the end of book one, you feel like, oh, the drama has been dealt with, and then the writers just bring it back up again in book two for like no reason. And it's always been a weird thing with the writing that I've never kind of quite got. So yeah, all this stuff is just great. And again, they accomplished this in the book with the least amount of episodes. If they had one more to bring it up to 13, that would have been fantastic. So there's that. And then we get into book two. So you can see here, I have 5 episodes in the top 10 and 2 episodes in the bottom 5. And I really do think that it's these 2 episodes are where like the whole weakness is in the book. Because once you get through Peacekeepers, which has like the breakup and stuff like that, the Raiko being like incredibly unreasonable, like what a character Raiko was, right? The Sting, I actually think, is a decent episode, because I actually like the Mako plot of being a detective. I just don't get the romance that they try to reignite again with those two. Don't get it at all. And I think it really took away from Asami, because in book 3, like, Asami wasn't really up to much. In book 2, she was there and had a plot, and then they just decided, like, we don't really know what to do at this point. So, romance? And this just gets into the whole thing of, like, I don't think they know what to do with Asami in the comics right now either, even though she has the relationship with Korra. Asami has just always been that character where they have some set exact things that they want to do with the character. If they can't do them, they don't really know where to incorporate her in. But with book 2, my thing has always been that I think Unalaq blends in as a villain so well with the book and what the book is trying to accomplish. The book is about spirituality, but it's also about family. Like, these episodes are called Civil Wars, like, sure, because they're kind of teasing a war between the water tribes, but it's also just the conflict between family members that they kind of explore in these episodes. And that's where, like, Unalaq works so well for me. Of, like, whenever I see people, I've heard this so much, Unalaq is like a one-dimensional villain, and I'm just kind of like, okay, I get it. He is the spiritual villain, but they specifically utilize the fact that he focuses on that so much, that he is ignoring the family connections that he has, which is interesting in a book that is sort of water tribe focused. The water tribes as a nation focus on family, and here's someone who doesn't. Like, he's related to Korra, but he is the one with all the information that Korra needs. And I think this is where, like, a lot of things with book 2 come down to, can you see Korra's perspective in these early episodes? Or do you just think she's being annoying? And I've always been like, no, I completely get Korra's side in this. That, I think Raiko is extremely unlikable and unreasonable in book 2. And I think that is why they just completely, dropped the character, in my mind, effectively in Turf Wars by giving the president role to Zhu Li. So there's that. And then with regards to her sort of conflict with her father, I don't get people who like are really heavily critical of Korra and think that Korra is like being disrespectful to Tonraq. That like Tonraq is like actively in these episodes sort of proposing that Korra like not be spiritual when she's the Avatar. And it's just that idea of like her mentor figures, her father and Tenzin, are not giving her really much respect at all as the Avatar. And Unalaq just walks in and knows exactly how, like, knows exactly what she needs, because he's manipulating her, but he's also giving her exactly what she needs. She needs someone to teach her to be actively spiritual. And this is, I think, the big point here, is that Tenzin tries to be her spiritual mentor, but he's not spiritual enough, at least. And that builds up, like, Tenzin's arc in this book is incredible as well. And the fact that people, I think, miss this almost at times, that with what they do with Tonraq and Tenzin, they confirm to you that you are meant to be on Korra's side in those episodes, because Tonraq at the end of Southern Lights has a realization of just like, oh, spiritually, like, this is what my daughter is actually capable of doing, and, you know, see it in a different way. And Tenzin has to understand that, you know, he's thought Korra airbending at this point. He can't be your spiritual mentor. His daughter can be, and he can be a personal mentor to her. And that's the key point, is the change in that relationship by the end of the book to not just being like Tenzin as the older master in the authority position, but the two of them being more sort of mutuals by the end of the book. Of like, Tenzin is more experienced, so he's able to advise Korra in different ways, but giving her the respect as the Avatar that wasn't there at the start. And now Korra has to develop as well, of course, over the course of the book as well. That too. But that's why I think there's so much power in the character arc for Korra in the finale, which is them going as far as to take away the spirit that makes Korra the Avatar and have her still be able to be strong, like, on her own spirit. And that's Korra's character arc, is that part of like the book 1 finale, why she feels so lost without her bending, is that she's defined herself by it her entire life. Now you get that realization that she can be strong even without being the Avatar, the thing that she's wanted to be her entire life, you know, because she's the opposite of Aang when it comes to being the Avatar. Aang was the reluctant Avatar. Korra is the Avatar who wanted to be the Avatar, wanted to fulfill the role the second she knew she was the Avatar. You know, hence that first line, you know, I'm the Avatar, you got to deal with it. That's really, really telling. And so, you know, from here, having Korra being the Avatar on her own, not having the backup of the past lives, but having to rely more on, you know, her father maybe, or Tenzin, or her friends, that works as well. Just highlighting that, you know, she's suffered because of this. Like, they lost so much with the loss of the past lives. That works for me. Beginning is like I've talked about so much, you know, my favorite episodes of Avatar, of course. World building at its finest in Avatar for me. These episodes explain so much that was sort of teased and suggested from Avatar, but the details weren't there. Now it finally comes full circle, and we know, okay, this is how the Avatar came into being. This is extra significant to the Line Turtles, which helps to further kind of explain a lot of the significance about, you know, what was going on with Aang in the finale here. That all works, but I always say it wasn't just that they had great technical explanations. They did, but the characters, they turned the spirit of the Avatar into a proper character Rava was a character that we met. Wan as the first Avatar, we got to know him before he even became the Avatar, to understand the type of character worthy of becoming the Avatar. And again, leading into this whole significance of Korra's arc in the finale, that, you know, Wan became the Avatar because of who he was, not because of like what he was. And just like Korra shouldn't define herself by what she is, and more of like who she is. Korra as a person can accomplish stuff on her own, and that was great. And to me, that's the strongest Korra character arc that you have. That, yeah, Korra is a little bit much to handle in some of these early episodes. Like, I'm on her side in a lot of the arguments she has with characters, but, you know, I think, you know, that there's value in just like she's a little bit full on at times here. But what she gets to by the end, because of her spiritual journey and character growth, is fantastic. And I think you see a lot in the speech that she gives at the end of Light in the Dark to set up Book 3 Change. Just acknowledging that things have changed in the world, you know, with the Avatar. Things are going to be different now. And that decision to keep the portals open has always been one of my favorite parts of Korra. That do any of the other Korra villains have an impact on Korra in the same way that Unalaq does on this decision here? That, like, Tenzin is just like, okay, I guess you close the portals and we'll go back. We'll head home. And she considers it and she thinks about it and stops. Sure, because she knows the backstory now from beginnings. But also because she realizes, wait, Unalaq, who I've just been fighting, my uncle, was talking about this. And going as far as he went, yeah, that was not right. But is he inherently wrong about, you know, the spirits, you know, not just remaining forever separate? And the answer is, like, it's about time to try again. Wan was right at the time to separate humans and spirits because of the situation that was present at the time. It's now time to try again, and I'm eager to see Korra continuing to try and resolve the issue, you know, kind of presented kind of here. The issue that a lot of the avatars have dealt with is just, how do you handle the human spirit conflict, and how do you do it well? Is there a resolution? Can it work? That's the key to all of this. Not to mention Janora's arc in book 2. She had a great arc in book 3, but her book 2 arc is just as incredible, because it's more interesting here, because she really does go from just being one of the Air Kids, the bookworm. She doesn't stand out that much in book 1, to actually being, you know, suddenly one of the main characters. And that's really, really incredible that they managed to do that in these episodes with her spiritual awakening. The guide ends up being a very important episode for her as a character, not to mention like a new spiritual age, and of course her involvement in the finale. That she earns her tattoos for a lot of the stuff in book 3, but also because of this as well. I really do like that. So I think we've covered Korra quite a bit here. So it's time to get to the placements, I suppose, here. And based on the way the chat has gone and what I've said, I really don't have a clue what way we're leaning on this sort of stuff. Because I really heavily do not agree with book 3 or book 4 being number 1. Like, I'll put it there if, like, a lot of the chat, like a decent amount of the chat, like, agree with that, but I just don't see it at this point after having kind of gone through it. Now, again, this is my opinion. My opinion is always going to be to want to move the list towards being like this, in the same way that you guys have your own individual lists and you want the combined list to look like yours. And this is where I'm kind of like, after everything that has been discussed, like, is book 1 somehow top just because it is so solid? That book 3 we discussed the problems, book 4 we discussed the problems. The villains, they have a lot of issues going on. Book 2 has issues because I suppose it takes more of, having a specific taste in things in Avatar to appreciate it so much. I don't know, it's an interesting one because from what I saw in the chat, a lot of the book 1 and 2 dislike feels like it comes down to, I don't like the romance drama. And the romance drama is mainly in book 1 and 2. And I don't want to just dismiss that criticism, but it kind of feels like, wait. Are we suddenly saying that the romance being a bit weaker in the first 2 books is a bigger problem than severe underdevelopment of villains in 2 of the books? Like, it feels like that's sort of what's being discussed here. Now, again, it's just a few chats where like it's so difficult in the chat to, I suppose, present every one of your opinions on the book. But there's that kind of going on. But I don't know, it's a weird one because it feels weird putting, if I put book 1 as number 1 almost, but I'm not going to argue with it because I've been saying for years that I think it's so good. Because this was when the Korra fandom was at its height. It fell off because of the gap between book 1 and 2 during the airing. I'm not even sure how much down to like the quality is why things fell off. But there was such a hype around the return of the show here, and obviously hype and stuff like that means like people, I suppose, do tend to lean towards the fight, the action of book 3 and some of the bigger character arcs that happen in book 4. But in terms of pure super solid episode to episode, the speculation, the drama, the intensity, there's so much going on here. Like, look at these episodes, like, and the winner is the attack on the arena, the reveal of Hiroshi in this episode, what an intense battle between Korra and Tarlok in this episode, both sort of in the media and then their actual fight. Out of the past finally getting the visions of Korra revealed, seeing an older Aang, an older Sokka, an older Toph. That's great. Turning the Tides is just a chaotic episode, but there's so much going on, so much action. Backstory of skeletons in the closet, plus some of the other stuff. The question really is, I suppose, just does this drop it down? Plus some of the other scenes here, because the Voice in the Night, I think, is really good. In terms of Korra's fear, the reveal, going to the revelation, the rally, is really good in this episode, and the opener is fantastic. So I don't know, it's like, it's the only thing going against this, just that it is the first book and things get better, like things get sort of more intense potentially in other books, but it's super solid. So I don't know, it feels like the way we're leaning is potentially book 1 air. Now again, we can switch the list around. We have to put some stuff in place here because we still have this to do. So then for the other placements, it's one of those ones where, like, obviously I would love to super heavily fight for book 2 not being the bottom, but if it is what people tend to want, I'll put it there if we have to. But like I said, like I'd be leaning towards something along the lines of this as my kind of list. But I don't know, but based on the chat, I'd almost say, is it like let me just look through some of the previous chats. Book 4. That based on the number of people in the chat, there were people who were saying book 3. So is the chat's list this, basically? Book 3 change. And then I'm not sure how much support for book 4 did I see or not, because again, this is where if we're going with that, for me personally, this is for the bottom spot basically. My top episode, my top book against my bottom book. So this is a weird one for me where I'm kind of like, I don't want to put book 2 last, and I would prefer to put book 4 last. So like, this is where like, if you basically, sorry, book 4. Whoops. Like, if I was to just based off what the chat has said, in combination with sort of my own kind of opinion being sort of like, I suppose, potentially the strongest one on the stream, that's kind of the way I'd go with it, in the sense of like, I didn't really see too much heavy criticism against book 1. I made my case for, obviously like what I like about book 3 and what I don't like about book 3, and especially because on my own list I have switched book 3 and 4 around. I don't mind as much this being the case. I'm well aware that book 2 is not going to be everyone's. I'm well aware that not everyone is going to like book 2 as much as I do. So I'm very cautious about like on this group list placing it too high up. And it really just comes down to book 4 balance of like, I didn't see too much like support or like particular disagreement with what I said about it. So it's a tough one. It's a tough one because again, I don't want sort of my voice to like overly stand out too much compared to everyone. So there's that. So yeah, it's an interesting one in that 1, 3, 2, 4. It's honestly an order I've never really seen someone put out before, because I don't typically see people place book 1 as their favorite, and then if they do that, you don't typically see it where book 2 probably like isn't the bottom. So it's an interesting one for sure. But yeah, it's just an example of like how difficult these lists kind of are to make, because ultimately as Avatar fans, like, we all like all of the books. Like even book 4 balance, which for me is kind of like the weakest, I suppose, or like book 1 water, I still really like it. Like I said when I was doing a lot of the episode rankings, it's like, okay, this episode is like really low down on my list, but it's still a like 75 out of 100 ranked episode. Like if I was to give it like an episode score, just because it's like only like 7 up from the bottom of the list doesn't mean I hate it. That sort of thing. Something always has to come in at the end. So there's that. And yeah, it's just like, it is an example of like, ultimately this one was just book 3 or 2, but for the most part the order was pretty easy to establish. This one, it's all over the place, because a lot of people will say book 3 is the best. Myself and a few other people will say book 2 is the best. I can always make the argument book 1 is the most solid, but I don't see people particularly promote it as being like the absolute best. I see some people say book 4 is the best, but I don't often see a lot of like reasoning behind that. And I would say ultimately, what I didn't see particularly in the chat was a lot of like, I think, really, really strong points countering the critiques that I brought up for book 3 and 4. And I think that's kind of like pretty fair to say. And it's why like on my channel, like I've been pretty clear about how I feel about all of the books. And in the comments and all those videos, like I don't often see particularly strong like, well, you're wrong about that criticism because of this type thing. And it's because like, okay, look, book 3 is good. I like it too. I think the Red Lotus are cool in their own way, but they're missing quite a lot, and it's kind of hard to ignore that as a criticism, that like Amon, Unalaq are kind of more fleshed out than some of the other ones. But again, it comes down to like, do you value that or not value that? Now, final thing before we finish the stream, combined list. What way are we doing this? So obviously the way it works is that our number one is either going to be Korra book 1 or Avatar book 3. So I think I can pretty handily say this. I don't think there's going to be much agreement with that. So there's that. Now, do we try and do the bottom of the list now? So I suppose, yeah. Well, let's do bottom here. So it's either going to be book 1 water or book 4 balance at the bottom. And I'd be still sort of inclined to go for book 1 at the bottom, book 1 water at the bottom. At least that's my reasoning, is that while I was pretty harsh on balance kind of going through it here, I still think, you know, that there's enough good stuff in terms of like the potential of Kuvira. But then I feel like I'm being harsh on Korra. I'm not sure. Balance at the bottom. It's one of those things where like it's the last book, and it was disappointing in some ways outside of like say Korra's character arc, that there's not as many standout moments, and in terms of stuff like in terms of stuff like even like a more smaller point, and I think this got brought up during the airbending discussion, bending discussion stream, which is that Jinora is an airbending master in book 4, but I don't feel like she got to stand out all that much, and there was just almost like a weird use of the characters at certain times throughout the book, in that Mako only came in right towards the end, really, in terms of actually getting to do some important stuff. Like, you didn't see too much of a lot of the other kind of more side characters, like Elaine and the like. There was definitely some weird stuff. It felt like book 4 struggles the most with what it's trying to do, because one, it's down an episode because of remembrances. There's no way they actually planned the content of that episode to be an actual episode. So I'm kind of like, I was about to say book 1 by default at the bottom, but is it book 4 balance here? I think it is. So there's the bottom. So we have placed 1 Avatar and 1 Korra. So the question is, so for number 2 on the list, it either has to be book 2 Earth or book 1 Air. So that's the way it works. So yeah, book 2 Earth or book 1 Air. I tend to be book 2 Earth still over book 1. Just because I think that the more episodes, it allows them to do a little bit more. This comparison is perhaps where, you know, it kind of suffers a little bit. So I kind of feel this kind of has to be the way it goes. Book 2 Earth. Then I suppose the question at this point is probably what will solve the list is number 6, is it book 2 spirits at 6, or is it book 1 water? This pretty much, I suppose, fixes the list pretty much, because if we put book 1 here, it's just the rest of the Korra list here at this point. So basically, like, is this the list? So we have that, and then it would be book 1 Air, book 3 Change, and book 2 Spirits. Is that the list? and then I'll just just so it's kind of clear which is which. That's the way I'd go with it. So I'll just see what people think about this. I really would say about the only change is probably, maybe based on what people were saying, is maybe 5, 6 swapped. Book 1 might be up to 5 ahead of Book 2 Spirits. I'd maybe have a little bit of a discussion to be had there. Just in terms of like, Book 2 Spirits does have so many like big, massive moments. It does have big character arcs, and is this comparing these to a situation where the weaker episodes of Book 1 Water do bring it down compared to Book 2 Spirits, which has beginnings, has the big 4-part finale, and you know it's a more even fight because, you know, Book 2 Spirits does have 14 episodes, so it's the longest book of Korra as well. I'm not sure, but let's see what people are saying is yeah. So people seem to be saying swap these two around. So let's see, Book 2 Spirits, Book 1 Water. And I'll just swap the colors on these. And there. So I think more of the chat are saying this is kind of the order, which is kind of interesting. How does it look compared to mine? Actually, my combined list is Fire, Spirit, Earth, air change, balance, water. Yeah. Even as I've been discussing it, I've kind of been like, I think water should be above balance. Even my own list, I think I should have water above balance. So I think that's roughly around where I think what most people are thinking for this one. Again, it's a bit of a weird list, you know, in terms of like trying to compile everyone's opinions together, in that I don't think what we were trying to accomplish here we weren't trying to find out just what the fandom at large thinks, because I think when you bring in like the entire fan base, you bring in a lot more of the sort of the casual audience. Whereas I think a lot of my audience is more of the like in-depth hardcore Avatar fans, who do have a little bit more of a nuanced take on the series versus like potentially people who've maybe only seen every book once or something like that. That if you did it that way, the way it would probably be is like, I don't know, like if I was to say like what the sort of like fandom overall list is, the fandom overall list would probably be like this: Book 3 Fire, Book 2 Earth, Book 1 Water, Book 3 Change, Book 4 Balance, Book 1 Air, Book 2 Spirits. If you were just to like ask me, what do you view as being the most sort of common ordering of the books based on the fandom overall, that's probably what I would say it is. Is that like I do feel a lot of people would straight away place everything Avatar above everything Korra. I think Book 3 above Book 2 tends to be the go-to opinion there. And then when it comes to Korra, I always see book 3 as being the top, then book 4, book 1 at 3, because I think people underrate it a little bit and don't consider it as much, and then it's not so low that it goes below Spirit, which has the bad reputation within the fandom. Actually, maybe the one change might actually be this. Sorry. That might be the one change, that book 3 gets such hype that it maybe gets above book 1, just because people definitely have the opinion that book 1 Water is definitely the weakest of ATLA. And that's the thing of like, look at that list compared to the one we came out with. It's like, okay, 3-2, but then suddenly book 1 Air, which is towards the bottom on what I would view as being the like average fan almost, is quite swapped around. So, and then book 4 Balance is a little bit lower down. It's not too different, but the Korra order changes quite a lot. Yeah. And again, a lot of it, I agree with that. A lot of it does depend on if you even like Korra, because there are people out there who don't like Korra at all, which it's going to be so interesting to see the reception when the Avatar Studios content gets announced, because I think there are going to be a section of the fandom that are going to be disappointed, that are just going to perhaps have to accept that maybe Avatar was just Avatar to them, that they like ATLA and that's it, that the Korra as a series, the comics, even there are some people who even don't like the Kyoshi novels, that they're just Avatar G1ers, that they like that initial show and that's it. And I'm interested to see that if people are willing to give, if they do announce like say a third series and it is something quite different, if they give it that chance. And I'd even be a little bit worried if they do announce say like an ATLA follow-up series with the characters when they're older, of like if there's still that situation going on, because you have that subsection of the fandom who has it locked in their heads that if Arani Has is not involved in the show, it is by default not as good as Avatar, and that Mike and Brian on their own are not good enough to write Avatar to the new Avatar to the quality of like ATLA, which I don't really agree with, but you know, that's just the way it is. And I don't know, it's going to be interesting. That's an interesting one. I think I might put book 3 Change at the top of the fandom overall list. I always hear people say it's as good as the best stuff in Avatar. That's an interesting one. I think the book 3 hype and how far it goes probably comes down to how much you value the action in Avatar. If you value that super highly, then I can see why, like, yeah, book 3 is probably like one of the absolute top things in the show. Otherwise, I'm not sure. I still think ATLA gets a lot of like praise. There's no way that anyone actually read the Kyoshi novels and said they don't like them. Well, I in general would agree with that, but like, have you read like some of the reviews for those novels on say Amazon or Audible for the audiobook? Now, admittedly there, like, it's such a widespread, it's the big marketplace. Of course you're going to get like a bad review or two in them, but there are people who say that like this isn't it, like, you know, what was it, one of the Amazon reviews or something like that was just kind of like, don't listen to all these other reviews praising this book, this is not as good as people are making it out. I'm just kind of like, I don't think you're going to get very far with that opinion based on it. So, but yeah, it's pretty like heavily. It's like 95% of people who read the Kyoshi novels really really like them. But yeah, we're not putting the Kyoshi novels on the list. This is just the this is just the books in terms of the shows. It will be interesting to see how it goes. It overall has a high rating on all platforms. Yeah, but read the 1% of the 1-2 star reviews, and you'll see the people who are like so picky with what they want. But yeah, don't read too much into them, of course. There's always stuff like that, and especially on Audible, people tend to be very critical of the narrator and stuff like that. As Avatar Studios stuff comes out, of course we can like add that to the list and so on. The movie, of course, is going to be interesting to see, of course, what it is. If it is sort of more of a standalone type thing with new characters, or if it is maybe, as what I think most people are maybe thinking, an ATLA movie. Yeah, it'll be interesting to place. But I think in terms of like comparing everything against each other, I am interested to see what the new series is. Like, if it is new characters, regardless of where it's set, where do people view that third series of like, can anything that they make now ever surpass Avatar? Will it fit in between Avatar and Korra? Or might people with a third series realize that actually Korra was quite good and this isn't quite it? That's going to be very interesting to consider. If just how newness factors into all of this and so on. So there's that. The movie is the best piece of Avatar. Changed my mind. Yeah, the Last Airbender movie. It's not great, but I don't think it's. I think there's a lot of like over criticism of the movie. Like I'm never going to say like the movie's underrated. Like it received the criticism I suppose it deserves. It's just that a lot of people who don't particularly care or maybe shouldn't care about the movie seem to talk about it a lot. So there's just that kind of thing going on. There's some elements of it that I think are kind of interesting, but for the most part, it has its problems, of course. Like some of the actor choices was kind of like weird. Some of the way they edited down the book to fit into one movie didn't work, but some of it is actually like, okay, that's actually kind of interesting. But the movie is what it is. But still, it's like that's why I'm very excited for a new Avatar movie, because I look forward to having a sort of better received Avatar movie going experience. That's what I'm really waiting for, is to be hyped going into this movie. The trailer is good, the fandom is excited, and we go in there to the showings, like midnight showing perhaps, and we just come out and everyone is just excited to talk about it, and not like it was with the Last Airbender movie where everyone's more excited to rip it apart as soon as possible. So that's the big thing there of like, maybe we might get our proper kind of movie going experience. But yeah, we're going to be waiting a while on any new content, I suppose. It's been a pretty bad couple of weeks when it comes to just the quality or amount of news that we've had. The last 2 weeks have been kind of a real struggle in terms of just like, what do I talk about? Like, there's been little pieces of news, like tiny pieces of news. Like the podcast announcement from the other day was kind of like, okay, that's cool. But the more and more I think about it, it's like, I don't think this is gonna be like the be all end all. It'll be fun, but I think once we're through a few episodes of the podcast, it'll just be a thing we sort of watch in the background and we move on. We still wait for new news. So that's interesting. But yeah, we're just stuck in this sort of situation where we're still a few weeks away potentially from like preview pages for the next comic. We're still a few weeks away from the next comic announcement or novel announcement. We're still like 2 months away from San Diego Comic-Con, which is probably the earliest we will get any news on Avatar Studios. So I'm very interested to see in like a few weeks, as we build up to Comic-Con at home, if we get the tease of like they have an Avatar panel and what it is. Because if it's just the same title as the Dark Horse stuff, we know we're probably not getting anything. But if we get like Avatar Studios panel, then we know like there has to be something there. The question is obviously, is it too early or not? That's hard to say. That's much harder to speculate on, is it, if it's early or not for it. But if they are planning to have the first piece of Avatar Studio content out before the... Because all the preview stuff that they said about it when they first announced Avatar Studios was that they will have like a movie and shows on the platform within the first 2 years of launch, which is from February 2022, February 2021, and 2 years on would be February 2023. So in 20 months or so, we're potentially going to have something Avatar related, meaning we'll have to get news about something sooner rather than later, because when Korra was first announced, it was announced at Comic-Con 2010. So we had information about Korra 2 years before it launched. I suppose it was more the sort of 20 months before it launched type thing. So that would be the hope. That would be the real hope, is that they have that first promo image, they have their concept art for some of the characters to show off at that panel, and potentially announce just, here's what the movie's going to be about, and potentially this is what the first series is going to be about. That's kind of what I think we're waiting for. And if they're really low on the announcements and they don't go all in, I think that's going to be a little bit frustrating. I think they need to go all out. They need to be this is the movie, this is the series, this is the spin-off, this is the short form content. We also have these new novels and these new comics. I want to see them go all out. And I hope that the slowdown with Dark Horse and what feels like a big delay with the novels, I hope that they're just holding that back to announce sort of everything all at once for a big sort of Avatar's return at Comic-Con. That's what I hope. So do we think the movie in 2022, or is that too early? Let's see. I'd say late 2022 is maybe possible, but I'd be, right now when we know nothing basically, just that Paramount want Avatar stuff within 2 years on the platform, I'd be thinking more kind of February 2023 is the kind of deadline type thing. But that would suggest that there's something Avatar Studios before then. So late 2022, I can see us at least maybe having a trailer for the movie by 2022, at some point in 2022. Next year is going to have to be the year where everything kicks off. We're going to have to know a year before it comes out what's going on. Will it be released 2022? I'm not sure. The question all comes down to, we're in production, how far along are they or not, in terms of where they're at right now. It seems like it's Mike Bryan and what other creative people they have involved in Avatar Studios initially coming up with the ideas for the first batch of content. So the first movie or two, the first series or two, what they're going to cover, and then they're going to launch the movie into production, and I suppose also the first series into production, because again, Mike and Brian are in a position where they're not I don't think they're going to be the showrunners on every single Avatar Studios project. They're just going to be the general overseers of everything. So there's going to be like a specific, director, showrunner for the movie, specific showrunner, director for the new series, whatever it is. So there's going to have to be a lot of people, and then the animation studio thing is also going to be probably the key factor here, in that you're going to need, pretty much regardless of what you're doing, whether it's a movie or a series, you need to have your animation studio and then give them at least probably a year for the quality of Avatar, if not like 15 months to put together what you need to do. And you probably need like 2 animation studios because you want to do a movie and a series and maybe a spin-off as well. So you can see where the kind of problem is going to come in terms of why everything is so slow, is because they have to ramp up potentially multiple productions at the same time while figuring out, just from a story perspective, what they want to cover or not. Which is, obviously the question of like, what if the movie is not Last Airbender, and that's the thing. From their perspective of like, what way are they thinking about this? Because if you ask me like, what movie will Mike and Brian do, I'd say they'll probably do something new. But because the first project is going to be a movie that's, I guess, going to have a theatrical run, I can't see them not having the first Avatar Studios movie, the first Avatar animated movie, not being related to ATLA in some way to ensure people actually go to see it. Just because I think you kind of want to avoid the kind of effect that maybe you can see that there sort of is with the fandom when it comes to the non-ATLA stuff. The fact that Korra isn't as well appreciated as Avatar, so it probably won't be a Korra movie. And then you ask the question of like, a new era of Avatar as a movie, can they market it well enough that it will bring in everyone? It'll obviously do okay regardless, I think, just because it will be Avatar related, Mike and Brian, animation, great. But it's hard to argue that just having ATLA and having those well-known characters on the movie poster won't bring in like 25% more like revenue, like that many more tickets sold. That's my perspective in terms of like, if Mike and Brian, if the only thing they are required to do from a creative perspective is to put out an ATLA movie and then they can do whatever they want, I think they'll jump at that. In terms of like, sure, that's what the fans want. Everyone wants to see the ATLA cast grown up. Who wouldn't go to see a movie kind of showing that in action outside of Korra Book 1 Air, flashbacks for the first time? I know I definitely would. So there has to be something ATLA at the start, I think, because yes, in a lot of the early stuff they've said is that like they wanted to go into new eras and stuff like that, and yeah, they'll do that. They'll get there. There's lots of room to work with, but like, I can't see them doing the movie and it being like Avatar after Korra. That to me, they won't do that. Would they do a Kyoshi movie? Perhaps it would work, but we have to factor in like, from a movie perspective, is Kyoshi well known enough outside of just the fan base that tickets would sell? And that's where I'm a little bit like, I think you need ATLA for that reason. And then once you've done an animated movie, then you can move into like, okay, this works. We can do this this thing as a movie. And I think that's probably what way they're going to play it. But again, that's just the early speculation. All I know is just that I am excited to finally, get that movie trailer. see that listed as coming out in the cinemas, buy my tickets, that sort of thing. I'm going to be so excited to see that, like the big return of Avatar after, in terms of animation, after, by the time it comes out, I guess it will be 8 or 9 years, depending on when exactly it comes out, since 2014. That's going to be huge, because that's more than double the gap there was between the end of Avatar and the start of Korra. That sort of stuff. And yeah, whenever there's new content, whenever there's a trailer, that is going to be news big enough to where, yeah, absolutely, there'll be a sort of, I guess, a bit of an impromptu live stream, whatever day it happens on. That's the sort of content that I'm super, super excited for, is, being able to do a live stream discussion on the trailer. And if there is an Avatar panel at SDCC, like, be on live stream there, to react to it and see either the hype or the crushing disappointment, like last few years. That will very much depend on whatever that panel is called, because if it's the same as the previous ones of just like celebrate Avatar and Korra with your favorite comic creators, I'm like, just kind of like, no, I don't think I will. But if Mike and Brian are there and it says Avatar Studios, I think we know we're on for something there, because even though I've never been able to go to one of these conventions, of course, because I'm from Ireland, it's been always so exciting to follow those panels, whether they live stream them or not, to just follow the news coming out of it. People taking pictures at the panel, them going live. I love that sort of thing. Covering that for the site and my channel back in like 2011, 12, 13, 14. Absolutely incredible. And I'm so excited to do that again. Are they having live streams at SDCC this year? I think they are, because it's Comic-Con at home, and I don't know how it works. I can't really remember, because I don't think there was much I was interested in at the last Comic-Con at home, but I'm assuming that because it's at home, everything is a stream and they'll just do it that way. So if there is an Avatar panel, I guess we will all be able to see it, I think. Just speculation, do you think Azula will play a part in the movie? And I think it's stuff like that is really exciting, in that if they do the movie and it is older ATLA characters, think about the moments that you are going to see loads of reaction videos to on YouTube once the movie is like out everywhere. Can you imagine people reacting to seeing an older Azula for the first time? Like, she just pops up in the middle of that movie in some way, whatever way it is, just seeing Azula again, and it's a clearly older Azula, a good few years past Smoke and Shadow. So even hardcore fans are like, whoa, Azula here, like much older, this is incredible. I would love to see that, in that I think myself and Greg, when was this? I think it was the last podcast afterwards. We had like an hour discussion after we finished the recording, and we were just discussing stuff like this, which is just like, what sort of stuff will get people excited. And we basically came to the conclusion that in so many ways, what an ATLA movie should be is pretty much just fan service. And what I mean by that is just, yeah, give us everything we want. Have the framework of this movie be like, these two characters are getting married. So there's a wedding. We're going to see a wedding of two of the characters. There's one or two of the kids already born. So you have a couple of the characters being parents. You just are giving us moments that we have wanted to see for years. And then you don't need to go crazy with the villain, but once you make the villain or villain group powerful enough, all we want to see at the end of that movie is just a big, long action scene where each member of Team Avatar gets to take down like 5 or 6 kind of powerful characters in their prime, at their peak, and just go to town. It doesn't even have to be too challenging. Maybe the main villain requires Aang to go into the Avatar state or something like that. But that's what you want to see. You want to see like 20-something-year-old Katara at her peak just annihilate some people. You want to see Sokka older with his sword, much more experienced warrior, just take out some people. Reveal stuff like, does Zuko have lightning now? That would be cool to reveal in a movie like this. And just everything about that, of like, is Suki still around? Because we know nothing about Sokka and Suki in the future. All of that would be, fantastic to see. Even Toph, just to get a sense for how powerful she is when she's older. All that stuff would be amazing to have actually happen. So, I think that's what they need. Like, don't overthink it. They don't need to overthink a movie like this. They just need to do a, hit moments that people want, tease maybe some things that you might cover in like a spin-off series or something like that. Set up some stuff, but just have it be a fun movie that people will enjoy seeing in the cinemas. That's the thing. And look, I'm sure that they probably want to do something big, impactful with, character arcs and stuff like that. But you have to keep in mind, an animated movie at most is going to be like 90 minutes. If you try to tell too much of a wild story, you're going to encounter sort of the Korra problem, but probably even worse. You're now restricted to even less episodes to try and build up a new big threat, introduce all these dynamics, and then do something. Instead, keep it simple. And keep in mind that probably the thing you need to hit the most is just, here are the characters that you've wanted to see older for, 14, 15 years? In terms of ATLA, the end of ATLA, I was wanting to see them when they're older. By the time this thing comes out, it could be 15 years. All the fans who... ooh, my nose got blocked there for a second. All the fans who were younger when ATLA came out are now at the age where show us the characters when they're older. Every time you show us glimpses, we're all over it. Just do more of that. And if that's a success, you can maybe even do the same with Korra. Do a Korra movie to continue that on. Because I think probably the thing I struggle the most with Avatar Studios is that I can't really see them committing to doing a multi-season ATLA show or a multi-season Korra show. I think they'll do maybe spin-offs related to them, movies related to them, but I think the series are definitely where they will do series back in time and cover this Avatar, or they'll go forward, that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I want to talk about. This is, I think, far and away the longest live stream I've done so far, because I suppose this Avatar Studios further speculation just kind of came upon us here at the end. But yeah, just quickly to run through this again, this is what we came up with. The agreement was pretty much there. Book 3 Fire, Book 2 Earth, Book 1 Water for Avatar. Some slight disagreement. Obviously there's going to be a fraction of people who want Book 2 above Book 3. The Korra list was very, very interesting, in that obviously it's different from my own list, but it's not exactly the same as I think any list that anyone in the chat put out. So again, we were trying to just come up with a combined list from what everyone was saying, and ultimately I think there were high opinions each way about Book 3, Book 2, Book 4. And there was sort of almost the most consensus that Book 1 is really good, it's solid, it doesn't have too many problems, so it, by default of what everyone had the least criticisms of, was kind of number 1. Then Book 3, Book 2, Book 4. That was kind of interesting. And then combining it together was, I think, relatively simple in the end, just highlighting that, okay, Book 1 Water is maybe a little bit weaker than Book 1, Book 3, and you can maybe make an argument for the other ones as well. So that's what we came up with. There more than likely will be another stream next week. I haven't decided on the topic yet, just because I find it so difficult with so little news happening to overly plan out much content ahead of time. So it's just sort of like what springs to mind for me. It probably won't be another ranking style video. It probably will be some other style of topic, but who knows? It could be a ranking thing. I'm not really sure. So I'll probably put out some sort of a post in the middle of the week, maybe asking people what they maybe want to hear topics on. Because I'm never sure. Like, if I come up with a topic, should I do it just as a video on the channel, or should I do a live stream on this topic? Because ultimately, I suppose technically I could do most of the videos I do as live streams. Only some of them require like the prep work ahead of time because of the editing that would be required. But there's that. We'll see what happens. But yeah, more than likely there will be a stream next week at the same time. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much the end of this one. So thanks everyone for joining me on this quite lengthy discussion about all of the books of Avatar and Korra, and then I suppose we had 30-40 minutes of speculation on Avatar Studios as well, showing that the hype is still there for Avatar Studios. So yeah, I guess that's the stream then. So yeah, thanks for watching, and bye. So